Good day and welcome to today's second web talk of the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation series, Unapologetic Zionism. Today we are fortunate to feature Dr. Alan Hertz, an authority on the Aboriginal rights of the Jewish people. I'm Andrea Spindle, Executive Director of the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation and today's moderator. Our organization is a registered Canadian charity focused on education about anti-Semitism and combating its many manifestations, including the most virulent, which today is anti-Zionism. We work to counter the negative, dishonest narratives about Israel and provide the historical and legal truth about the rights of Jews to the land of Israel. The Jewish people are the original people since forming the first Jewish national home in ancient Israel millennia ago. Jews have legal rights to reconstitute the Jewish homeland in Israel as agreed to by the United Nations and confirmed in international law. Jews need to acknowledge that Judaism has been Zionist for millennia, well before the late 19th century birth of political Zionism as a secular movement. One of our major goals is to help generate greater pride in Zionism, especially among our young people, and engage with faculty, administration, as well as students to help end the bigoted, anti-Semitic, and dangerous Israel Apartheid Week on campuses across Canada. We need your help, so please make a donation to CAEF if you support our goals and our programming. Before formally introducing Dr. Hertz, let me remind everyone that your mics will remain muted, but your questions are welcome. Type them in the Q&A box, and we will have Dr. Hertz answer as many as possible after his presentation. The presentation will be recorded and will be posted on our website tomorrow. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Alan Hertz. Dr. Hertz is a native Montrealer who has lived in the United States, Austria, Turkey, Hong Kong, and the People's Republic of China. He studied European history and languages at McGill University, where he graduated with first-class honors and received the Minister of Education's Gold Medal in History. And he was then a Woodrow Wilson Fellow at Columbia University, where he studied East European and Ottoman history and received an MA and PhD. He also has international law degrees from Cambridge University and the University of Toronto. Before retirement in 2006, Dr. Hertz was a senior policy advisor in Canada's Privy Council office, serving the Prime Minister and the Federal Cabinet. Earlier, he was in the Foreign Affairs Department, where he advised on intellectual property rights. He participated in treaty negotiations, one of which all of us will be familiar with, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And he represented Canada at the World Trade Organization and at the World Intellectual Property Organization. Dr. Hertz taught history and law at universities in New York, Montreal, Toronto, and Hong Kong. Among his many talents, Alan Hertz is fluent in several languages, including German, French, and I heard Ottoman, Turkish, and Yiddish. What interested me in the extreme was the more than decade-long research he undertook, sourcing many original documents that led to his yet unpublished book, The Aboriginal Rights of the Jewish People. Alan took the time to send me a critique in response to my writing about the legal rights of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, advising that our rights are even stronger when considered in the light of anthropological and ethnocultural considerations, and he sent me a link to his paper on the subject. I had been convinced that Jews were indigenous to the land, as well as legally entitled to it, but had never thought to distinguish the meaning between indigenous and Aboriginal. Both are used interchangeably when we speak of Canada's First People. While Alan has been far more incisive and deliberate in his choice of words and found the historical proofs to support his thesis, and I'm very excited to have him share this with us today. So over to Alan.
Hi. When we speak about the Aboriginal rights of the Jewish people, we are invoking an examination of history that has a wide lens that is not limited to the 20th century It's not even limited to the period since Columbus in 1492, when the Western countries began to play an increasingly important role in the world, and when the Western countries reached out through navigation and trade and colonization. The Aboriginal rights of the Jewish people is a story that goes back much farther. It involves the ethnogenesis, the birth of a people. It involves the ethnogenesis of the Jewish people, which, according to the sources that are outside the Bible, can be verified certainly in the 8th century BCE. So we're talking about a bearer of rights, a people, an ethnos, a tribe that goes back to such a far time that few other peoples have been functioning objectively and subjectively over such a period of time. So this is something like saying that the Hudson's Bay Company received a patent from King Charles II in the late 17th century, and that objectively and subjectively, the Hudson's Bay Company has been in business for all those decades and centuries since the late 17th century. So the Jewish people has been, in the eyes of other people and in its own eyes, has been a player in history. Certainly, and when I mean the Jewish people, I mean literally Yehudim, I mean Jewish in quotation marks. I'm not referring to Israelites, I'm not referring to ancient Hebrews, I'm actually talking about a specific people in history with a specific name, in the exact way that the Hudson's Bay Company received a patent from Charles II and was known as the Hudson's Bay Company subjectively and objectively. So over such a period of time, the Jewish people had certain ideas as a tribe, as a collectivity. They had certain cultural ideas that were geographical. They had a peculiar, specific conception of their homeland. So, for example, in historical themes, we're familiar with the notion of empire, where historical figures like Alexander the Great will start with a core region, Macedonia, and then through the adventure of war will create a worldwide empire. By contrast, the Jewish people, since around for about 2,700 years, has never been attracted to the idea of empire, but this tribe, this group of people culturally and in religious terms, have had a fixation on a particular homeland. And this is not informal. This is part of the theology. It's part of the sacred lore of the Jewish people, this focus on the homeland and their relationship to the homeland. There were times in antiquity when the Jewish people was actually the majority in its homeland, and in which it had what people today would call sovereignty. And there were times over most of the last 2,000 years when the Jewish people did not exercise sovereignty in its homeland. So the question is, when the Jewish people became a minority in its homeland, probably at some time in the 6th century of the Common Era, down to the present day, down to today, what sort of rights did the Jews affirm and maintain and exercise across those almost 2,000 years? And those are quite simply Aboriginal rights of entry, of settlement, of sojourn and settlement. So entry is you enter the sacred homeland, sojourn, you travel around to the holy places, and finally you settle in the homeland. These are the specific Aboriginal rights that the Jewish people have exercised for more than 2,000 years. And these are the Aboriginal rights that the Jews maintain to this day. Now, having said that, with focus on rights of entry and settlement, I want to explain why I call this Aboriginal rights and not Indigenous rights. The Canadian Constitution refers to the Aboriginal rights of the Aboriginal rights of the First Nations in Canada. Aboriginal has to be distinguished from Indigenous. An Aboriginal people can be Indigenous, but not all Indigenous peoples are Aboriginal. And the distinction can be approached even etymologically in looking at the Latin derivation of Aboriginal, which is ab origine, which means from the beginning. Whereas Indigenous is from indigenus, which means born in the land. So logically, it is possible for there to be in a particular territory more than one Aboriginal people. But it is not possible for there to exist today in the land. There can be more than one Indigenous people, but there can only be one Aboriginal people. And this is extremely important because it suggests that we can distinguish rights that pertain to the Aboriginal people that don't necessarily pertain to later Indigenous peoples or to other peoples who arrived in the territory by conquest or other means. Now, since 2007, in international law, we have been concerned with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This is a document which primarily is intended to regulate the relationship between a state, which is presumed to be, in the context of the modern world, it's presumed to be a colonialist state that has emerged through processes of colonization and westernization. So the relationship of that state with pre-existing Indigenous peoples. This is the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is something that complements and enhances the theme of the Aboriginal rights of the Jewish people, but it is a small part of the much larger story, the much deeper story of Jewish rights in the land of Israel. For example, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, 2007, contains no definition of the meaning of, no definition of a people. It contains no definition of an indigenous people, and it has no information about what you do when you have more than one indigenous people, nor does it say anything about an Aboriginal people. And because it is framed from the point of view of the post-Columbus experience, it doesn't address the situation of the Jewish people, which has been in Eretz Israel as an Aboriginal people going back 2 millennia. We also are not especially interested if some committee of the United Nations appoints a rapporteur, some professor somewhere, to write an article or a report about the meaning of an indigenous people. I personally am not concerned about the authority of that rapporteur. He's just another academic. He's just another person who writes something. It doesn't even have the force of a General Assembly resolution, and even if it did, it doesn't address the rights of the Aboriginal rights of the Jewish people. It doesn't address the topic of Aboriginal rights, and we should never refer to the Aboriginal rights of the Jewish people with United Nations language that talks about Indigenous, because we want to ensure that the United Nations has a small place in the world, that its activities are recognized, but to understand that it's just one player in a very complex world system. There are many aspects of public international law that are very interesting and which we would want to invoke in discussions about the situation of the Jewish people. But I want to offer you an interesting parallel that might not mean much to people outside of Canada. But after the last referendum in 1995, the federal government began a series of actions to try to determine where we were in relation to the relatively narrow Federalist win in the 1995 referendum. And one of the efforts that the federal government made was to draw together from various countries in the world a panel of famous public international lawyers. And they set to work writing their various studies in Switzerland, in Germany, in whichever country. And they handed the federal government studies which essentially showed that under public international law, Quebec did not have a right to secede from Canada. Too poor. It's just simply on a referendum vote or with nothing more, that prima facie Quebec did not have a right under public international law to leave Canada. So this is where we get into the fascinating point. Quebec Premier Lucien Bouchard then told the Globe and Mail, he said, Quebec's right to determine its own future does not depend on Canadian constitutional law and does not depend on public international law. And that's all he said. So we want to know, it struck me as a very important statement, although I had yet to begin my work on the Aboriginal rights of the Jewish people. It was a long time afterwards that I began to work, or several years afterwards. And then if you know what he could be referring to, particularly because he, apart from anything else, had studied civil law, you know that Premier Bouchard was referring to natural rights. He was implying that somehow beyond public international law, there could be a natural right that the Quebec people have to determine their future, no matter what professors of public international law say, no matter what the Supreme Court of Canada says. Now, this is an important clue that when you're in a tight position, or when the question is of having a discourse about rights, or defending your client in the court of history, or speaking for your people, if you happen to be a small Aboriginal tribe in Canada, or you happen to be you're speaking for the Jewish people, that there are important.
Yeah. Hello.
Well, they did.
Okay, there are important elements of human conscience. There are important juridical elements that may be underemphasized in public international law, or are beyond public international law.
They baited it with some food or something, I guess.
And that public international law as a system is just another legal system among the many other legal systems that have informed the human conscience in the course of the history of the world, and of course the history of Western civilization. Now, having therefore called for broader attention to juridical and ethical sources, I want to emphasize that at the birth of modern international law, so I'm referring to the settlement after the First World War, that there were a series of declarations, resolutions, and treaties between 1917 and 1924. And the clear meaning of these treaties, and half of them are very specific in this regard, focuses relevant to the topic of today's talk. These treaties focus on the rights of entry and settlement that belong to the Jewish people. These treaties, and I'll give you two examples. One of them is the July 1922 Palestine Mandate of the League of Nations, and the other is the 1924 Anglo-American Treaty. These treaties are still either in force or have legal effects today. They have enduring legal effects. The interpretations may be different, but they have enduring legal effects as, first of all, recognized by the Permanent Court of International Justice in the interwar period, and even by the International Court of Justice in the post-war period. So what is at issue in talking about the Aboriginal rights of the Jewish people is that the reason that they were embodied in treaties was because they had a very great effect on the conscience of the mind, on the conscience of the individuals who crafted the post-World War I settlement. And those Aboriginal rights of entry and settlement are still effective in the year 2020. So where we stand today in 2020 is that the Jewish people have a right to enter and settle in their historic homeland. This is the Aboriginal right. The Aboriginal right as embodied in the treaty right is the Jews have a right to settle between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. These are not obscure questions. These are also the governing treaties. These are the relevant treaties. These are the treaties that specifically refer to the subject matter, namely to the land between the Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea. Some tangential reference in the Fourth Geneva Convention that indicates that an occupying power cannot transfer its population cannot possibly affect a treaty of general effect that makes no specific reference to the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, cannot possibly affect the Aboriginal rights of the Jewish people that are 2,000 years old and have already been recognized in treaties that specifically call for close settlement by Jews on the land everywhere from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River. That this is in terms of a legal discussion, this is a very powerful thing for a Jew to say. It is a very powerful thing for the Jewish people to say. And at the end of the day, all of these matters of international law are generally a discussion about rights in which every government and every lawyer working for a government, every lawyer working for NGOs, and every layman can participate. The last thing that we want to have, and this was my reaction while I was still working for the Canadian government in 2004, and the International Court of Justice had released an advisory opinion on the legal effects of building the wall in the, quote, occupied Palestinian territory. I felt very frustrated. I was too busy with my government work, but I felt very frustrated because I wanted to have something to say that was meaningful. And then after I left the government, I turned to a number of years examining what there was to say. And I found that crafting powerful legal arguments for the Jewish people is really very easy. That the anxiety that I had, that I wouldn't be able to redeem the honor of the Jewish people from the imputations that were offered by other institutions or by opponents, by enemies of the Jewish people. That anxiety that I had that it would be difficult was shown, in fact, to be otherwise. And that the topic of Jewish rights is as rich as the topic of Jewish history. So, for example, when you are talking about a customary right of entry and settlement, you can go back over the course of 2,000 years and find episodes where people tried to exclude the Jews from their homeland. And those attempts to exclude the Jews from their homeland always failed. And other people, non-Jews, other people, through the course of those 2,000 years, provided evidence of the Aboriginal rights of the Jewish people. So, for example, the Jews have been praying at the Western Wall in Jerusalem for centuries. We have from the Ottoman Turkish government, we have fermans, edicts of the Ottoman Sultan affirming the right of the Jews to pray at the Western Wall. And you know, this goes on, and in closing, I would say in the 20th century, we had first, with the post-war treaties, we had the affirmation of the Aboriginal rights of the Jewish people, the rights of entry and settlement. And then by 1939, when it was no longer convenient for the British, they issued the white paper, the Palestine white paper of 1939. And they said within 5 years, the right of entry for Jews would be shut down unless there was approval of that right by the Arabs of Palestine. And the Jewish people, first of all, friends of the Jewish people canceled that British argument because from 1945 until 1948, Harry Truman, President of the United States, forced the British, achieved the entry of the Jews into Palestine. He forced the British. He never relented. So he affirmed the rights of the Jewish people, the Aboriginal right of entry. And then the Jewish people themselves, on the battlefield, first the people in Tel Aviv, the Jewish people, the Yeshuv, the community, on the afternoon of May the 14th, they declared the independence of Israel. And they won a war in which many Jews were killed, but that war affirmed the right of Jews to enter Israel and settle. And that was, of course, embodied in the law of return, in the domestic law of Israel. But these are just examples of negation and affirmation, a pattern that you can trace over 2,000 years. And the history is extremely meaningful. It is not nostalgia. It is not feel-good history. it is the history that affirms a right of a living people, a people that was known and famous in all those centuries, and which, as indicated in the declaration of the 1948 Declaration of the Establishment of the State of Israel, that Jews were always living in Israel as a minority in the last 2,000 years, and that they always were striving to come back in each generation. So this process of affirming the Aboriginal rights of the Jewish people. So I guess we should turn to perhaps questions.
We do have some questions. Thank you very much, Dr. Hertz. I'll start with a simple question, which is what has inspired you? How did you come to this work? I know that it was years and years worth of work. I've seen some of your papers you've shared with me. So can you just give us a sense of what this has meant to you? Obviously, you are an unapologetic Zionist. Can you tell us what's important here, personally?
Well, I felt I had a responsibility because my background is I worked in government, so I was doing public policy, ultimately in the Privy Council, which is the highest part of the Canadian government in terms of the civil service advising the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. So I had this experience in public policy, and while I was at the Privy Council, one of my functions for part of that time was to advise the Prime Minister on the intergovernmental aspects of the relationship among the Aboriginal peoples of Canada, the municipalities of Canada, the provinces of Canada, and the federal government, because there's a lot of diplomacy there. And that theme dovetailed with some earlier parts of my life, where even as an undergraduate, I was studying the multi-ethnic Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then as a graduate student, I was studying the multi-ethnic Ottoman Empire, which incidentally included Eretz Israel. And so all of these elements, including studying international law at Cambridge and other places, suddenly when I retired, helped me in my sense that I wanted to reply to the 2004 advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, which had made a mockery of the interpretation of the Palestine Mandate of the League of Nations and of the Covenant of the League of Nations. And so I felt that this was the time to roll up my sleeves, and I published perhaps as early as 2009 in the Jerusalem Post an op-ed on this topic, and worked intensively on it, and have been working intensively on it until the present. The last phase of my work on this has to do with the French Revolution, and it has to do with the recognition of Jewish peoplehood during the French Revolution, and particularly in the form of proclamations and letters which Napoleon issued to the Jewish people, perhaps starting in late 1797 and continuing until 1799, when he was actually campaigning in Eretz Israel. And why this attracted me was because it had become, among some historians, fashionable to dismiss this idea that Napoleon had issued a proclamation inviting Jews to come back to Jerusalem, calling for the creation of a Jewish government in Jerusalem, And so I have, I'm probably at about 100 pages of research on that aspect of evidence of recognition by Napoleon of the hereditary right of the Israelites to Palestine. So it's again this aspect on the human conscience, the conscience of the French Revolution. So this is enough to keep a person busy for a lifetime. And I really hope that that historians, whether in Israel or elsewhere, will turn to Jewish history not only as anecdote or episodic meaning, but will actually see the normative, juridical meaning of Jewish history, that history creates rights. It's commonplace in the contemporary North American context to believe that suffering and oppression gives rise to rights. And so I think there's a role for anthropologists and historians. Psychologists even could play a role. I just want to give you an example of the leap from is to ought, to move from the factual statement to the normative plane. And anyone who has ever raised children knows this, that let's say you go to pick up your child from school every day at 3:20. And every day after you pick up the child, you do this 10 to 25 times, you go directly to Baskin Robbins and you buy the kid a strawberry ice cream cone or whatever he or she wants. And then, God forbid, on the 35th occasion, you don't do it. So first of all, the kid is going to say, I have a right to the ice cream cone because it had been repeated. And subjectively, the parent will feel too in his conscience. They will say, even though I never signed anything or I didn't promise that this would go on forever, in the mind of the parent, there is a feeling of obligation, and that the parent would offer a defense why the parent can't meet the obligation on this particular occasion. And so what I want to say is that it's not possible for objective people, for people without prejudice. It is not possible for the Jews post the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. It is not possible for Jews to have entered, sojourned, and settled in Eretz Israel for 2,000 years, and that would not attract moral weight. It is not possible anthropologically, it is not possible psychologically, and for anyone who doubts, I'll stick them with the post-World War I treaties. Now, the British tried a song and a dance to subvert the League of Nations in June 1939. They tried to sweet talk the Permanent Mandates Commission into koshering, into agreeing to the new British interpretation that those treaties were not about Jewish rights of settlement. The League of Nations turned them down. The League of Nations left the British hanging. But they kept on, the British kept on, trying to pervert the meaning of those treaties. And today, public international law as a boutique discipline, public international law is a narrow political concern that has very little to do with the morality of the world. Public international law has joined in this 1939 British cancellation of the Jewish rights of settlement in Eretz Israel. But there is a lot more in the world than professors of international law. There's a lot more, as I learned when I was in the government of Canada, there's a lot more of politics and aspiration and hope and morality and religion. And there are many more legal systems. So what I'm suggesting is there is no credibility. Going back to the example of the parent buying the ice cream, there is no credibility to the suggestion that the Jews do not have Aboriginal rights of entry, sojourn, settlement. There is no credibility to the suggestion that the Anglo-American Treaty and the Palestine Mandate of the League of Nations are not about Jewish rights of settlement in Eretz Israel. This is pure fantasy.
Okay.
Pure fantasy in the face of the literal text of these weighty documents. Long answer.
No, great. I appreciate that. Very fulsome, and you got the emotion that I was expecting. I have a couple of questions from our audience.
Okay.
I have a feeling that I know the answer to one, but let me ask. There were, on the Jews returned from Egypt to Eretz Yisrael, our understanding there were Hittites, Moabites, Amorites, and other peoples there. Therefore, can the Jews claim to be Aboriginal if other peoples were there, even though, and this is maybe the exception, we know they were returning to Israel at that time. They'd already been there.
I don't know anything about the Hebrews. I don't know anything about the Israelites. I mean, for my purposes as someone who studies the Jewish people, who studies this notion of what is a people, and a people has a particular name, a particular people has enemies. Like Einstein said, he was asking, I think in 1946, he said this was before the independence of Israel. So he said, well, some people say that the Jews are not a nation, that they're not a people because they don't have a government. And Einstein said, well, just look at what their enemies say. How come you have so many people talking about the Jews? So as a people, and so they must be a people. So my concern is not with the Hebrews or the Israelites. I'm concerned with a Jewish people, Yehudim, a people about which we have a lot of extra biblical evidence, not just things from the Bible. And second of all, when we are talking about an Aboriginal people, we're talking about a practical discussion. So we're talking about, of all the extant peoples in Eretz Israel, the only one left from that period is the Jewish people. Maybe the Samaritans are also left. I don't think that the Samaritans can claim chronological priority over the Jews, particularly because of extra biblical evidence that in some cases goes back to the 9th century. 9th century epigraphic references to the House of David, and a lot of material from the 8th century BCE, like outside of the Bible.
Right. Yeah, it's my impression that most of the peoples that I listed and that were in the question are really disappeared. So
They're disappeared, and there's also I think there's a lot of misconceptions also looking back. We have a sort of a landmark or an alp of linguistics that Hebrew is a Canaanitic language. So we don't know really, I mean, I don't know, I'm not telling what other people, I don't know whether the Jews came from outside of Canaan. All I know is that the evidence shows that when we first can prove that there is a Jewish people, that they are in Canaan and that they're speaking a Canaanitic language, so that even if someone would say you know, I think since 1967, there has been a Palestinian people that the local Arabs have generally self-identified as Palestinians, so we can't question that. But they've never had a consistent story about who their ancestors are. One moment they say it's Philistines, one moment they say it's Phoenicians, one moment they say it's Canaanites. Well, it's very interesting that for all we know, the Jews are also Canaanites, except the Jews have, like the Hudson's Bay Company, under Charles II of England, the Jews have been in business under the same trademark, under the same name.
Right.
They have been in business continuously since the, clearly since the 8th century BCE.
Well, you point out that the so-called Palestinians could be claiming earlier history. My understanding is that the majority have come from outside of Eretz Israel, from Arabia, from Egypt, Lebanon, from surrounding areas. Is there a community, an Arab community that could claim to also be Aboriginal, or would they be Indigenous?
Well, I mean, there's two parts of it. There's or three parts of it. I mean, three-part answer. The first thing I want to say is that looking at the present population of Eretz Israel, it would be very hard to find anybody who could conclusively prove that their ancestors had been there steady state since the last 2,500 years. This is a very busy Afro-Asian corridor which has been subjected to radical depopulation at various periods, particularly in the last millennium. And all the population groups have renewed themselves continually like a revolving door from sources outside of Eretz Israel. So if you're talking about Muslims who are today living in Eretz Israel, a lot of Muslims left. A lot were killed, died, left. Other Muslims came in from various places. If you're talking about Arabs, the same thing applies. If you're talking about Jews, all the people there, all the peoples there are in the same group. And second of all, about when we're talking about some people today who might be claiming ancestry, looking at the experience of the Canadian Aboriginal tribes and looking at the Supreme Court of Canada, there is some technique to this business of Aboriginal rights. You can't just today, under name X, claim that you're descended from group Y of ancient history, when in all the intervening centuries, you weren't making that claim, and even more so, you were claiming to be someone else. It doesn't work that way, and that the claim to Aboriginal rights or to be an Aboriginal people is not a claim of the self-determination of genes, and it's not of the Aboriginal rights of genes. It's all about a people. It's about a people in history. So it's fairly complicated, and in the recent dispute between the People's Republic of China and the Philippines over the South China Sea. So some China, although China lost the arbitration, some Chinese people said, oh, you better be careful when you start to argue with the Chinese about history, because we Chinese have a lot of history. And also the Chinese have historians. And so you get into a historical argument with the People's Republic of China or with China, you have to understand that you're going to be dealing with a lot of history, because you're dealing with a famous people. You're dealing with a people that has existed for a very, very long time and has maintained a civilization and culture for a very long time. In the same time, when when people think that they're going to make a killing by advancing a historical argument against the Jewish people, it is a very, very foolish tactic, because the Jewish people is a famous people. It was known to the Romans. It was known to, for example, in the 8th century BCE, it was known to the Neo-Akkadians, who were then the dominant imperial power in that part of the world. So it is derisory for people to try to read back into previous centuries any notion of, quote, Palestinian peoplehood. There is certainly a Palestinian people today, born after 1967. Before, they called themselves Muslim Arabs. They still consider themselves Muslims and Arabs. But the people who call themselves Palestinians, if any, such, the people who called themselves Palestinians around 1900 or 1910 were all Christian. We're all Christians. So this is a new. The Palestinian people is a new venture. The rights of the Jewish people and the rights of the Palestinian people are not the same, and we wouldn't want them to have the same rights, because they could never, on the basis of equality, the only thing they can do is fight. If, however, the rights of the Jewish people are a bit different from the Palestinian people, there could be, as in Canada, the Supreme Court of Canada tries to look at the rights of the Aboriginal people, look at the rights of other Canadians and Canadian communities, provinces, and bringing it together tries to see where you can gratify and recognize the rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada, or the rights of a particular tribe, with minimum interference or conflict with the rights of other Canadians, or the rights of municipalities, or the rights of provinces. This is a hopeful technique in regard to Hertz Israel, a hopeful technique that for purposes of peacemaking, one can see that the rights of the two peoples are not the same.
So maybe what follows is the next question. If we take the Aboriginal rights approach, would it not suggest that the Canadian government should have no say? It's recent that the government's decided it should tell the Israelis they cannot annex land. They hadn't proposed to annex it in the first place. That's number one, is how do we use this within the Canadian context? And I want to slip this in as well. I want to know whether you have shared this with Israeli leaders, and whether this history would not serve the Israeli government, and they ought to be using it as well.
Well, the Canadian government is entitled to look after the interests of Canada, as the Canadian governments from time to time are elected by the Canadian people. They can decide what is in the interests of Canada. At one moment, Canada will seem to be drawing closer to the People's Republic of China. The next moment, there are some events, and Canada has some problems with the People's Republic of China. We have to have respect for the needs of the duly elected government of Canada. My presentation on the Aboriginal rights of the Jewish people is a very limited presentation. It doesn't deal with the rights of Israel as a government, as a state within the international state system. There are many other positive and negative things that Israel deals with in terms of politics or international law arguments. And I actually don't mean to discount international law arguments. I'm just saying actually I'm saying to international lawyers, whether they work for the Israel government or for universities or to Friends of Israel, I'm just saying, add this argument of the rights of entry, sojourn, and settlement. Add it to your your repertoire. And I think that for people who are friends of Israel, I think it's a very powerful argument, because let's fight this battle up front. So let us immediately attack the paradigm that this is a discussion about imperialism and Westerners coming to the Middle East, and that Israel is a colonial entity. Let's break the back. Let's not even go down road to argue many other things, that we should always be telling people that of all the extant peoples, the Jewish people has the strongest right to be Aboriginal to the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, that there have always been Jews in Eretz Israel, although a minority, and that Jews have a 2,000-year-old or longer right to enter that territory, to go and see the holy sites, to travel around, and to settle in that territory. Now, it's very interesting. Einstein, in 1946, I actually have the letter. Einstein sent a letter to an aggrieved Jew in Chicago. And this Jew wanted to know why Einstein, at the 1946 Anglo-American Committee, hadn't backed the creation of a Jewish state. And Einstein wrote, well, you know, Jews, as of 1946 perhaps, Einstein wrote, Jews are only 1/3 of the population of Palestine. You know, how can you expect that there's going to be a Jewish state when the Jews are only 1/3? But what Einstein did say was that in that letter, he affirmed the right of Jews to enter and settle in Palestine and to build up the Jewish home there. So, and as did Prime Minister David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill and other, Woodrow Wilson, they believed that the Jews had a right to enter and settle, and that in due course, if it ever happened that Jews were the majority, that they would, in due course,
Form a state.
They would form a state, that they would, the territory there would exist on that basis. And I feel that my biggest problem is that I don't go and live in Israel. Ben Gurion once said that the Zionists should be people who go and live in Israel. And I think that the biggest problem in Israel is that we don't have enough Jews there.
Well, this is the last question, and we have many here. There's people will be disappointed, but several people have asked, have you presented your work to other bodies, whether the United Nations or even the United Nations Watch Organization, to the Israeli government or the Canadian government? Have you shared this widely?
It has been shared, but I haven't. I'm not an organization. I'm just an individual scholar appealing to the conscience of humanity, I think it's extremely important that the reason I'm doing this is because I don't believe in the United Nations. I don't believe the United Nations represents a positive force in the world. And I'm not concerned particularly. I know about the law of the UN Charter. I'm not particularly concerned with the law of the UN Charter. And I want to warn my Jewish friends, I want to warn my fellow Jews to beware of the United Nations and the UN Charter, and don't expect that tomorrow you're going to get recognition by the United Nations as currently constituted. You're not going to get that recognition. So like Lucien Bouchard, I started with Lucien Bouchard. He was very hurt that not only that he had lost the 1995 referendum, but that these experts on public international law had said that Quebecers don't have a right under public international law to secede from Canada. So he said, we have to begin looking at other things. We have to assess our situation. We have to step up our game. We have to be more innovative. We have to educate our people. We have to develop our self-respect and have something to say. When people tell us, oh, these experts on public international law came from Switzerland, they deny the Quebec people's right to independence. Well, you have to have something to say. And so what, I'm not playing the game of, I'm not playing the game of pretending that I'm an important person and then I'm going to go to governments and then I'm going to teach them what is the law. I am participating in a dialogue and I want to help other friends of Israel enrich their dialogue.
Thank you. I think you've done that. I hope everybody that's attended today feels that. It was really a pleasure to have you, Dr. Hertz, and it's been a pleasure to get to know you, and I really appreciate what you've given us. And continue as an unapologetic Zionist, and I hope everybody listening will feel the same. And I wish everyone a good day, and I hope you'll continue to support the work of the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation. Go to our website. It's very simple. It's just www.caef.ca, and this lecture will be on our website tomorrow. Thanks, everyone. Bye now.